Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Just so you know, it is being recorded, and I think the goal of this is to have a little information session that we can share wider after this meeting so that others who weren't able to join us today can certainly gather the information. But before we jump into it, and Sarah and Kevin are going to give a quick presentation on some of our no problem, Caesar. Some of our information data gathering as it pertains to our next Connect SoCal plan. Just wanted to give a little context for this meeting in and of itself. We've been preparing a sustainable community strategy for, several years now. And certainly when we first started that process, we gathered together a group of business advisory group that became known as our GLUE Council, Global Land Use and Economic Council. And as we worked through the multiple cycles of regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy, we certainly have sought input and advice from that group on how best to work with the business community and the building community as we're developing this plans. What has tended to happen in previous cycles is we certainly start, and Kevin and Sarah will explain, by reaching out to our cities and getting updated forecast information for the horizon year of the plan. That information gets compiled, and then sent back out, usually closer to the public input process of the plan to wider audiences. And often what happens at that time is many members of the building community are certainly looking to see how their projects, larger entitled projects, might be represented in the plan. Well, based on input that we got from our business community and certainly some of the lessons learned that we've learned over the last couple cycles, we wanted to try to front load some of those conversations. And as of now, we certainly have been meeting with many of our cities and local jurisdictions and have made great progress on getting some of the updated growth projections for our next plan. But we also wanted to start that conversation with the building industry earlier in the cycle while we're getting that information to really kind of front load some of those conversations that you might have directly with cities that you have projects in, or perhaps with us to better understand that. So this session is really to just let you all know what our new process looks like and hopefully just demystify some of the work that goes into gathering information that becomes part of the RTP SCS. And although we're still a year plus away from, really preparing that final draft plan, even, it certainly is an important time in that kind of data collection process. So just want to thank you for dedicating some time to being here. We certainly appreciate it and know that, again, this is kind of a session that was requested by some of our GLUE advisory members to reach out early to the broader building industry. And so this is really your meeting. But we certainly will have just some updated information that Sarah and Kevin will provide to kind of set the stage for where we're at and what the current process looks like, and certainly some opportunities for input over the months ahead. So with that, Sarah.
Thank you, Darren. So like Darren mentioned, the purpose of today's meeting is to inform the development community during an earlier stage of plan development about how we develop our required forecasted regional development pattern. My colleague Kevin Kane will detail the specifics about our approach to help inform you about how we're reflecting future growth and development in our plan, and then disclose how we reflect key entitled projects within the plan. And since we're at an earlier data collection phase of plan development, it's easiest and most beneficial for us to be having this conversation now, since we can still be making changes to the plan rather than when we're at a later draft plan release stage. So first, I'm going to start with a really high level case, in case anybody's unfamiliar with SCAG as organization, or the Southern California Association of Governments. We're the largest metropolitan planning organization in the nation. We represent the 6 counties you see here, which includes 191 cities and almost 19 million residents. And then Connect SoCal that was mentioned is a federally and state mandated document let me see if I can advance the slide, excuse me. Also known as a regional transportation plan or sustainable community strategy. So this is a plan, I went too far, excuse me, I should have waited for the delay. But this is a plan that we must update every 4 years. It has a 20-year time horizon. So for this current plan that we're updating, which will be adopted in 2024, it extends out to 2050. Two of the main components of the plan are a project list that has over 6,000 transportation projects that are planned to be developed over that 20-year time horizon. And then this regional development pattern, or the forecasted regional development pattern. And then when these two things are combined, the planned transportation projects, the land use pattern, when they're combined, that is meant to enable us to meet multiple goals, as well as our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets set by the state. And meeting these requirements from both the federal and level and the state is critical for maintaining funding for a region on transportation projects. Obviously, the federal requirements are necessary for us to maintain any federal transportation funding, but then increasingly our state target, the GHG reduction target, and achieving that is necessary for getting funding through some SB1 funded programs such as the TSEP. And in fact, due to our achievement of the 2020 SES target, projects in the SCAG region secured nearly $925 million in state funding since that adoption. So next, the kind of like the why does it matter? Beyond the critical transportation funding, there's also implications of SCAG's SES, or the forecasted development pattern, on development projects. The two primary implications are the CEQA streamlining provisions in SB 375, and then state funding program eligibility. Now, the state funding program eligibility, that varies depending on the guidelines updates of each of the state funding programs. Like, for example, some of the GGRF funding programs, like the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program, the SGC has some like broad requirements of a region having an SES, or a project supports implementation of an SES. So not spatially specific, but still having a general tie to the SCS from SCAG. However, the state statute is clear that cities and counties are not required to update their land use plans or regulations to be consistent with the RTP SCS. And the SCS does not supersede land use authority of cities or counties. So kind of why are we talking now? We're, like I mentioned, we're at the data collection phase of plan development. So this, we have an upcoming deadline for jurisdictions on December 2nd for them to provide input and sign off to SCAG on inclusion of their data in Connect SoCal. Sorry, the slide will advance hopefully in just a moment. But basically the point is that we're meeting with you now. We have some time to be looking at this preliminary data and before we start to do analysis into next year. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to provide some more specifics on our approach and methodology for developing this forecasted development pattern.
Cool, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. Good to be here. Thanks for coming. Nice to see some familiar names and faces in the room. But I'll try to keep this a little bit general for the benefit of anyone kind of watching later as well. I'd like to think of the Connect SoCal forecast side in terms of spatial scale. You know, a 19 million person region is really different from roughly a 1,000 person neighborhood when you're trying to look at 2050, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here in the plan. And our job through the vehicle or regional plan is to harmonize all of those spatial scales. The numbers that we use have to be technically sound. That's to say they need to reflect reasonably foreseeable future growth by 2050. You know, what you see at all of the scales is going to be reflective to some degree of how the world has changed in the last 4 years. You know, oftentimes you look 4 years back to our last plan as a benchmark, but obviously there are myriad things, as we know well, that have changed in the last 4 years. So just to kind of take a really high level look, and I know I've presented this a couple of times at GLUE and at our policy committee meetings, what you see here is a comparison of the last Connect SoCal, which ran from 2016 to 2045, and the plan which is under development now, which has a horizon of 2019 as a base year and 2050 as the horizon year. For a number of reasons, we're looking at only about half the population growth as the last plan, 9% versus almost 20%. That means that job growth is about 3/4 of what it was in the last plan. You can grow jobs without population growth to a certain point, but not forever. But on the side of households, which is the third factor here, because of higher incidence of aging, generally smaller household sizes that we expect in the future, and pent-up demand from things like overcrowding, the household growth forecast is about 90% of what it was last cycle. So it's actually quite close still. A key piece, again, that's unique to an MPO's regional plan is that these three elements have to be balanced. We have to be able to demonstrate that there are enough people for the jobs and enough housing for the people, to put it kind of in shorthand. But what's our actual statutory requirement here? Regional forecast is fairly straightforward: births, deaths, migration, economic competitiveness. What we really have to do per statute is come up with, quote, a forecasted development pattern for the region. It's not a demographic forecast. That wouldn't tell us where the growth goes in the region, nor is it a map of build out. If we were putting together a map of build out and all the available space in Southern California to build, we'd probably have about 5 times as much as we see in this technically sound reasonable projection, which I do have to admit is probably a little bit on the optimistic side, but in any case, the point being not, between a demographic forecast and a build out scenario. It's a regional plan. It's a balanced vision that has to hit the targets that Sarah mentioned earlier. Because of this, our general MO is that we maintain this process as being rooted in local planning. Ultimately, that's what's operative as local general plans and local land use authority, being steered by a regional vision. That's to say, the regional projection, in addition to kind of the regionally consistent set of policies, strategies, transportation investments, what have you. And finally, being aligned with state and federal policy. And that third bullet is where we mean the greenhouse gas targets and the transportation conformity targets from the feds. So that's the kind of the general ether of a forecasted regional development pattern. And you see in the middle the map of last cycle's forecasted regional development pattern, a little bit scraggly, but I do want to point out that in past cycles we have often referred to this as something like a policy scenario or a growth vision. And we typically do a separate exercise after we develop the data, after we meet with all local jurisdictions to kind of talk about growth numbers. But what we're statutorily required to do is not necessarily a separate scenario process. It is to put together this forecasted regional development pattern that has these inputs and these targets. So at the end of the day, it's interesting to contrast the spatial scales. We work at some spatial scales, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's kind of about the pattern and how we get there. That being said, TAZs, transportation analysis zones, which are basically neighborhoods, is what kind of a good shorthand for them, are really the standardized building block. So unfortunately, I think my animations here are a little bit slow. Apologies. So I'd like to talk about how we get there. In the past, we've called this process the local input process. This time we're calling it local data exchange, or LDX. Basically, in this shorthand summarized view, there are 6 categories of ingredients to a regional plan, a lot of which are the purview of local jurisdictions: land use, transportation, priority development, geographical boundaries, that's kind of the nuts and bolts of just the maps, green region resource areas, a lot of things called out in SB 375 for kind of environmental factors, and then growth, a preliminary projection of growth that gets refined through input from local jurisdictions. In February 2022, we put together the first 5 of these categories and released them in the form of data map books to local jurisdictions, as well as a web-based tool called the RDP, or Regional Data Platform. So there's a PDF version that's available online for each jurisdiction. You see it there. I think this is the 3rd or 4th cycle that we've done this series. And there's also a credential login for local jurisdictions to be able to work with the data a little bit more interactively and dynamically, and share it amongst themselves, plop out some images, what have you, and explore a little bit better than in the past. So we're kind of proud to have that, but we always have the legacy version publicly available online in terms of the PDFs here. And if we zoom in a little bit to these 6 categories, I'm going to focus on really the 2 that are probably the most operative: land use inputs, and then the preliminary growth forecast. The objective of local data exchange is to have cities review and edit these layers. And this layer list is pretty similar to what we have had in the last plan. So we strive to meet with one-on-one with all the region's jurisdictions and go through all these map layers inform them about Connect SoCal, our input process, and solicit feedback. And as of today, I think we've hit 133 of those meetings. So a pretty big quadrennial effort to actually find and get to all the local jurisdictions in Southern California. One point I'd like to emphasize again is that for Connect SoCal 2024, we're not planning on having a separate scenario exercise afterwards. In the past, the preliminary growth numbers, which I said for this cycle has been out for about 6 months, they've been up since May. In the past, these were very linear. We would add things like priority growth areas, environmentally sensitive areas. We would add these after the cities review the numbers. But this cycle, we've kind of changed the order of things a little bit. The numbers that we've put out already take into account the sustainability-based strategies of Connect SoCal 2020, our last adopted plan. These include things like priority development areas, some of the environmentally sensitive areas. The reason for doing this is that so this information is a more open part of plan development, so that local jurisdictions have the chance to review it and edit it if needed in a transparent and open process as much as possible. So that being said, TAZs are really the building blocks. Again, the process isn't, the statutory requirement of a forecasted development pattern is agnostic to spatial scale, but TAZs still are really the building block. We do get asked from time to time, why not just use development entitlements or entitlement agreements? It's a little bit tricky if we're trying to standardize apples to apples across a large region. The definition, the timing, the size can vary greatly. Project scheduling is certainly a factor. And you can have this lingua franca of the TAZ level numbers that summarizes a little bit, but when we have the say 10,000 foot view of a regional plan, it's quite effective. We do have a space in LDX for local jurisdictions to inform us of what we call key entitlements, and that database is a holdover from the last plan. This information can certainly help our modeling team get in a little bit more detail. It's also a nice tool for local jurisdictions to kind of isolate some of the larger spots that they anticipate growing in some way and focusing on that unit. But ultimately, at the end of the day, our objective is to kind of standardize this into the language of TAZ level numbers. So again, the overall development pattern, we're aiming for it to be technically sound to reach the plan goals. And again, it's not seen as a full build out scenario. Now the data map books, which I mentioned and linked before, and I'm happy to plop those into the chat momentarily, also do include a page of the TAZ level numbers, the preliminary TAZ level numbers that are out for local review, in addition to a map there as well. So certainly perhaps not the most convenient way to interact with data, but my goodness, we have such a range of cities, sizes, stakeholders, GIS expertise, what have you. At the very least, we're happy that we're able to have the data in this map book format here. And I'll reiterate again, this is SCAG's first cut. The reason that we have local data exchange is because this isn't complete. This isn't a fully baked plan yet or a forecasted regional development plan yet. We really need local jurisdiction buy-in, especially now when we're in a time that housing elements are in a period of flux. We're appreciative of the fact that we're not going to be having 100% complete housing element data in addition to whatever zoning and general plan changes may stem from that as an input into this plan. Thus local input for us is particularly important this time around. So what we're asking for local jurisdictions at the end of the day, and we're asking this of city staff, ideally planning director level or above, is for them to provide us with the sign off of these ingredients, of these data pieces that are used in Connect SoCal. Historically, not everybody has provided us with this. It's to a degree a question of, oh, what's in it for me? But we're really hopeful to meet with pretty much everybody. Last cycle, we actually met with all 197 jurisdictions. This cycle, we're targeting a little bit less because there has been a lot of staff turnover at cities. But I think we're still doing quite a good job of reaching everybody. Plus, we have some new data tools to kind of help out with that. For the household and employment growth numbers that we are going to use for the regional plan, we are asking for a little bit of explanation. And again, the reason is that we're not doing a separate scenario process afterwards. We do want to make sure that we're able to demonstrate to state regulators that we can hit the targets of the RTP and SES, and that they'll do what we say they will. So giving a little bit more information about whether or not a growth number in a particular neighborhood or maybe jurisdiction wide is not consistent with an assessment of general plan capacity, or perhaps their view, a local jurisdiction's view of the likelihood and size and scale of development entitlement that exists. Or if perhaps there were zoning or plan changes resulting from the 6th-cycle housing element update, which is still underway, and is going to be hopefully reflected fairly well, but we can't say with 100% certainty that every parcel from the supply side will be. In addition, finally, we're asking, well, if there are other types of or other conceptualizations of priority growth areas in a jurisdiction's view, if there are other supportive policies for, say, sustainable transportation in one area or another, noting that is helpful to weave that into a plan. And finally, if there is a higher development potential in some green region or green region type of resource areas, following the environmental factors in SB 375, we have to take into account if there are some mitigation plans or things like that reduce the overall or aggregate risk. That's certainly something that's helpful to send our way so that we can weave it into a plan. It's also a way to export best practices across the region. If one city is doing something that's really positive for regional goals for other cities to kind of know about it, and for us to be able to elevate that region wide is always an advantage. So I'll leave it with, I think we just have this next steps here slide. And I'll emphasize that, it's easiest to make changes now in the data development phase. Apologies on our end. There's only about a month left or so in the process. These have been out for a few months so far. But, a regional plan does have many interlocking parts. And because it does take nearly a year to develop the data and to meet with all the jurisdictions to get the information out, it's certainly easiest to kind of do some of the review right now. We're asking that, if from this group there are any questions or comments, certainly on key entitled projects, or if you want to discuss a little bit more, to reach out with us in the next few weeks here. I think we've got kind of November 18th penciled in, just to be able to provide a little bit of time before that December 2nd local jurisdiction deadline. So that's what's happening now. We anticipate in spring 2023 to do an assessment of everything once we stitch it all together. If every jurisdiction says that they are going to build out to their build out, we're going to have an issue, because I don't necessarily see 8 million households growing in the region by 2050. I don't know that our demographic panel of experts would either, but generally it all works out fairly effectively. We do some technical robustness assessment on our end too. Not only for the demographic economic side, but to the extent we can on some of the sustainability measures too. We'll also be having the required series of Connect SoCal public workshops in spring of next year as we march toward draft plan release next fall and final plan adoption, hopefully in April of 2024. So that's it. I'll leave it there. Here's my contact information, Kane at SCAG, if you'd like to kind of get in touch. And thank you.